I've been quiet today because I found myself, I've had a fabulous day. I think the two panels have been really interesting, but I found myself in a context in which the terms of reference are different for me. At the moment I live in Australia. I've been living there for more or less 10 years now, and there are two or three things that I found different with the terms of reference for today in an interesting way. One is the reference to the Ethnographic Museum. Now, I might be wrong, but I can't think of a museum in Australia that calls itself an ethnographic museum. There are, of course, the materials that many people would call ethnographic here, but I can't think of a museum that calls itself such. And by and large, most of the materials that we would call ethnographic would be by and large curated by Indigenous Australians in one way and another, or co-curated by them. So that's one sort of difference. The second is there's a reference to colonial pasts. Colonialism is very, very present in Australia. It is a settler colonial society. It's still a settler colonial society, and colonial relationships are still immensely powerful. The third thing that I found different is the discussion in the last session about the importance of the figure of the migrant, and I understand why that's the case in terms of Europe at the moment, with the refugee crisis and so on and so forth. But you wouldn't invoke the figure of the migrant in quite the same way in Australian museum debates for two or three reasons. One, because Australia's extremely repressive policing of its borders mean that there are very few refugees in Australia. They're by and large posted through exercises of regional colonialism in Manus Island and so on. You'll know about this. But secondly, there are lots of migrants in Australia. It's a multicultural society. But nonetheless, and there are significant issues for migrants in terms of museum issues. But nonetheless, if we look at the question of museum politics from the point of view of Indigenous Australians, migrants are colonists. They're parts of colonial histories. So the figure of the migrant has a different sort of like salience. So I found these terms of reference a little bit different. So we might come back and talk about those. So a little bit of background before I come directly to my topic. I want just to refer very briefly to the book that Peter referred to before introducing my topic, because what I'm saying has its background in this collective research project on the relationship between anthropological fieldwork, museums, and processes of governance in the early 20th century. A project that I took part in together with, well, the people whom you see there. I just want to say a few words about this project because it provides some of the kind of theoretical framework that I'll be drawing on in my presentation. So it set out to do three things. First, it set out to examine the range of social, cultural, political, and technological factors that shape the relationships between anthropologists and Indigenous peoples in the context of their fieldwork encounters in the early 20th century, and in doing so, shape what was collected and how what was collected was carried back to the museums from which anthropological fieldwork expeditions typically set forth. We then looked at the processes of ordering through which the materials brought back from the field were managed and arranged into particular museum exhibition formats. And our final concern was with processes of governing, focused on how these systems of ordering contributed to the development of the conceptual framework that shaped the governmental logics informing the relations between colonial and colonized populations. But while this book forms a background to my concerns, the topic for my lecture today belongs to a completely different historical period. It addresses the politics of museums in Australia today, rather than those of 100 years ago. However, apart from drawing on the theoretical perspectives that inform this study, I also want to take my bearings from two maps that the contributions of two colleagues on this research project, Rodney Harrison and Ira Draknis, drew to my attention, and the links between these and a third map. The first map is Clark Whistler's map of the Plains Indians culture area and the importance of the role that such mappings of culture areas played in the projects of early 20th century anthropology. This notion of the culture area reflected the influence of Whistler. There's Whistler. Boas's successor as the lead anthropologist at the American Museum of Natural History from about 1905 on. The significance of the concept of the culture area as territorial groupings of practices from diverse sources which conferred on them their distinctive meanings. Okay, so I just want to log that there. The second map, this is Norman Tyndall's 1940 map. Norman Tyndall's an Australian anthropologist. He was the lead anthropologist at the South Australia Museum at the time this map was produced. And this is, you can't see the details, but this is a mapping of Australian languages and cultures to different areas of Australia. So there are all lines across the map dividing it up into different areas of indigenous languages, a mapping of Aboriginal languages and culture to different areas of Australia. It's a map that was the outcome of a distinctive set of interactions in the interwar periods between American and Australian anthropology, and specifically between Whistler and Tyndall. There's Tyndall. Although I have to say I'm not sure whether it's Boris Karloff as Frankenstein, but I mean, it's an unfortunate photograph. But the map was the result of interactions between American and Australian anthropology, specifically between Whistler and Tyndall. But the third map I want to look at is this. The Australian Institute for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies map, which is now featured in many museums in Australia. There it is in Cooktown Museum as a map indicating the cultural areas of Aboriginal Australia. And what I want to do is to trace how the concept of the culture area derived from American anthropology that informs these maps that are now widely used, or maps like them that are widely used in Australian museums, has also come to inform what I'm calling the process of recollecting ourselves. That is, the reordering of the relations between the items of Australian Indigenous culture by recollecting them back to their territorially defined communities. That informs contemporary renegotiations of the relations between Australian national and Australian Indigenous culture, negotiations in which museums are key players. And I'm going to illustrate this by discussing the controversies and tensions occasioned by an exhibition hosted by the National Museum of Australia over the end of 2015, the start of 2016, called Encounters, an exhibition that featured temporarily returned items from the British Museum's collection of Aboriginal materials. First, though, what I want to do is to review some more general historical developments in order to place these concerns in the broader context of the main changes that have taken place in the organisation of the discursive terrain that has shaped the relations between Indigenous or non-Indigenous Australia over the post-war period. Some of you will be familiar with these, but all of you won't, and I'd like all of you to have some idea about this broader context. The first concerns the role played by archaeological excavations and the use of carbon dating techniques to establish a deep time for Indigenous Australians by extending the period of their occupation of Australia that is validated by Western knowledges. I mean, Indigenous knowledges claimed this a long, long time ago anyway, but the significance is now they're being validated by Western knowledges, extending the period of their validated occupation of Australia then to initially 40,000, later 60,000, and now over the last few weeks, 80,000 years. This has given rise to a complex set of relations between the Western discipline of archaeology and the Aboriginal conceptions of time associated with what is popularly known as the dream time, but now give rise to the claim that's made all the time by Indigenous Australians that they represent the longest continuous human culture on the planet. Thus, importantly, shallowing out places like Stonehenge or as mere, youth, really. If these has validated the longevity of Aboriginal culture, the very conception of Aboriginal culture reflects a related change in the relationships between Aboriginal knowledge practices and another Western discipline, anthropology. Of course, many of the rituals, traditions, customs, and practices that are now grouped under the heading of Aboriginal culture were recognized by late 19th and early 20th century anthropologists in Australia. So far as the relations between the settler state and Aborigines were concerned, Aboriginal customary practices were most commonly and influentially interpreted as throwbacks to earlier stages of evolution. And the conception of this as something that was shared by all Aborigines, and this is my key point, tended to divert attention away from customs and traditions that distinguished different Aboriginal nations or tribal groups. There was some recognition of those in the mid to late 19th century, but by and large this concern with the differentiation of Aborigines into territorially defined groups was displaced by a concern with what it was all Aborigines had in common by being backward. So there was little sense of these interacting with one another in such a way as to add up to distinctive cultures in the sense of constituting territorially anchored ways of life with their own distinctive values and formal properties. The interpretive grids provided by the Boasian culture concept had little appreciable influence in Australia before the 1914-18 war, and its influence in the interwar period was both sporadic and selective. It has, however, beginning in the late 1940s and early 1950s, since contributed to the development of new relationships between anthropology and indigenous communities with a range of complex and often contradictory implications for the subsequent conceptions of Aboriginal culture and its place in the national culture. I'll come back to that. But the influence of this Boasian anthropological concept of culture, which I'll elaborate in more detail shortly, has been paralleled by the positive political inflections of the concept of race, which at a slightly later date and via different routes and networks also made a trans-Pacific crossing from the United States to Australia. I draw here on the work of Kamala Visweswaran, her book Uncommon Cultures, who, reflecting on the reasons for the black civil rights activist W.E. Du Bois's refusal to adopt the culture concept associated with the Boasian anthropological tradition, stresses instead the political inflection Du Bois lent to mid-19th century conceptions of race as an inherited bloodline. Du Bois's innovation consisted in his interpretation of such inherited continuities as both a result of shared experiences of colonial and racial repression and a source of opposition to these. And we can see what is involved here in Du Bois's response when asked what his African ancestry meant to him, acknowledging his inheritance of certain physical characteristics of colour and hair. He qualifies the significance of these. Of more importance, he says, is the fact that since the 15th century, these ancestors of mine and their other descendants have had a common history, have suffered a common disaster, and have one long memory. But the physical bond is least, and the badge of colour relatively unimportant, save as a badge. The real essence of this kinship is its social heritage of slavery and discrimination and insult. This non-essentialist conception of race, uniting peoples through their experience of shared oppression, has played a significant role in shaping contemporary Indigenous political movements. And their influence in Australia has been evident in the forms of pan-Aboriginal cultural activism developed by Indigenous Australians in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, and often in significant dialogue with American black consciousness movements. The fourth development concerns the changing relations between anthropology, art history, and aesthetics with regard to the classification and curation and exhibition of Aboriginal art. Originally exiled from the category of art proper and denied any historical dynamic, Aboriginal art practices were initially classified as solely of ethnographic interest, and until roughly the mid-20th century, their exhibition in museums was arranged exclusively within an ethnographic framing. Over the intervening period, the categories of Australian art history have been revised and are continually being revised. There's a very interesting process of revision going on to valorise both traditional and contemporary urban Aboriginal art practices. At the same time, the development of productive interfaces between contemporary Aboriginal art practice and post-expressionist forms of contemporary art have supported anti-essentialist understandings of Aboriginal art. There are different forms of it related to different groups. All right, then, these then are the general contours of the changing relations between a range of Indigenous, intellectual, political and cultural practices and the Western knowledges informing museum practices that underlie my concerns with the forms of recollecting ourselves that are in play in contemporary Australian museum practices. I intend this phrase to refer to a range of critical interfaces that have been produced between Indigenous Australians acting in a variety of capacities as community members, curators, artists and activists, and museums through which Indigenous Australians have reasserted varying degrees of symbolic and material control over collections that were earlier ceded to museums in varying relations of unequal exchange. At the same time, however, I shall argue that the selves that are thus recollected are not and cannot be exclusively or essentially indigenous, but are also caught up in ongoing processes of refashioning the materials comprising the heritage field to yield a range of new hybridized identities and national pasts. So I want to go back to this 1996 map of Aboriginal Australia. This is the second of what have perhaps been the two most influential ways of presenting Indigenous artifacts in Australian museums, this sort of interpretation of culture areas. The first is the series showing possible developments of boomerangs from ordinary throwing stick and of sword from boomerang that the anthropologist Baldwin Spencer arranged at the National Museum of Victoria in 1901 on the eve of Federation. Federation in 1901 was the year in which what were hitherto 5 or 6 separate colonies in Australia were brought together and established as a nation relatively independent from Britain. In contrast to the territorializing logic of the map, this series was constructed by bringing together throwing sticks, swords and boomerangs from different parts of Australia, extracting them from the particular contexts of the specific indigenous nations they were taken from, in order to present them as part of a single pan-Aboriginal account of the evolution of the boomerang and into swords. As such, it reflected a specific set of conditions governing the fieldwork practices that Baldwin Spencer conducted in Central Australia with his colleague Francis Gillen. And I just want to run briefly through these. The role of stations on the overland telegraph that was newly opened between Adelaide in the south of Australia and Darwin in the north, and of railways and government ration depots was important in providing points where Aborigines periodically congregated and where, therefore, they might be brought into the orbit of fieldwork investigations. Then there were the guides and sometimes Aboriginal trackers on whom the fieldworkers relied to find their way around often hostile terrain, and the horses and camels that were the main source of transport for the anthropologists, their equipment, and so on. There were the measuring and recording devices that mediated the relationship between anthropologist and subjects: cameras, films, sliding calipers, anthropometric devices, devices for taking blood samples and fingerprints, and so on. But it's the role of telegraph stations that I'll focus on here. Spencer and Gillen's 1901-2 expedition across Central Australia kept close to the telegraph line wherever possible, with telegraph stations constituting their main stopping places. These also functioned with the gradual cessation of warlike exchanges across the colonial frontier as significant contact zones for the relations, contact zones in quotes, for the relations between anthropologists and the Aboriginal populations of remote regions. This is reflected in the photograph taken in 1901 of the Barrow Creek Telegraph Station, some 300 kilometres north of Alice Springs, that Spencer and Gillen use in their across Australia to evoke a past scene of a treacherous attack by the natives on the station shortly after its opening in 1872, but a scene of past violence that only served to emphasise their presentation of it as, in the early 20th century, a place where the power of settler Australia now operated securely in a region where it had hitherto been exercised only sporadically. So there's a whole set of forces here that are brought to bear upon the anthropological fieldwork encounter that have to do with the role of the telegraph and so on in a crucial period of early state formation in Australia. This then was one of the sites from which Spencer and Gillen collected Indigenous materials, which, when brought back to the National Museum of Victoria, Spencer combined with materials collected from other parts of Australia as parts of evolutionary sequences leading from the simple to the complex, as with the sequence, this one again, leading from the throwing stick to the boomerang at the National Museum of Victoria in 1901. Modelled on Henry Pitt Rivers' evolutionary displays at the University of Oxford, and Spencer had worked there before going to Australia, it's nonetheless different from these in one important respect. Pitt Rivers' displays characteristically resulted in long evolutionary sequences in which each object, abstracted from its originating milieu, represented a stage in a universal sequence of development, leading from the simple and primitive to the developed and complex. But these were typically open-ended series. They hadn't finished, there was more to come. Spencer's series, however, is that of a self-enclosed evolutionary series that has come to an end. His introduction to the 1901 guide to the National Museum of Victoria's ethnographic collections interpreted these as testimonies to a series of non-developments, a people with no cultivation of the land, no domestic animals, no writing, which, attributed to the joint effects of the isolation of indigenous Australians from the flows of competition and their subjection to the tyranny of custom, added up to a frozen history that was not in any way connected with or led into Australia's fledgling national culture. No more a part of Australia's future than of its constitution. On the colonial frontier, the maintenance of a gap between the settler and indigenous populations had become increasingly important. For a good part of the 19th century, this gap had been regarded as potentially bridgeable via civilizational programs designed to carry Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples across it. By 1901, however, it had come to be viewed as an unbridgeable chasm and one that was increasingly racialized. So, the question I want to pose is, how do we get from that, as one frame it, to this? How do we get from A to B? The result of a research project organised by the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies to map all the language, nation and tribal groups of Aboriginal Australia. This map has its conceptual roots in the longer history of mapping projects that spatialise the relationships between different Aboriginal groups by territorialising them. Well, not without precedent, the key figure in this process of what one historian has tellingly called laying down the country or reducing the country to order, country being the Aboriginal word for home territory. Laying down the country or reducing the country to order was Norman Tyndale, whose map, going back to that, whose map showing the distribution of the Aboriginal tribes of Australia was a game changer in this regard. Although not published in its final form until 1974, this map was the result of research stretching back to the start of the 1930s and was later significantly influenced by the Harvard-Adelaide University's anthropological expedition of 1938-9, the first version of the map being published in 1940. Its significance was that of demonstrating that Aboriginal groups did relate territorially to distinct regions that could be successfully mapped, something that had been denied in a good deal of the early 20th century anthropology. As such, it testified to the influence of the Boasian tradition in American anthropology as mediated by Franz Boas, there he is, student and successor Clark Whistler, there he is again, who collaborated with Tyndale in projects funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. Now, Whistler played a key role in systematizing the culture area concept by translating it into maps which, as Tyndale acknowledged, had contributed to the conceptualization of his own mapping projects. But it did so in ways that initially continued to echo the racial underpinnings of Australian anthropology. If Tyndale saw value in the concept of culture areas, this was as much from the point of view of mapping physiological traits alongside laws, languages, and customs within a biomedical model of indigenous governance that aimed to breed out the colour, as it was concerned with mapping cultures. This concern to breed out the colour reflected not a cultural model of assimilation of the kind that was advocated by anthropologists after the war, but a process of somatic merging across 3 generations. Quoting Tyndall, 2 successive accessions of white blood lead to the emergence of the Aboriginal in the white community. Most important, perhaps, like many mapping projects, Tyndall's map incorporated an attribute of a cadastral survey of, as James Scott puts it, seeing like a state, that was envisaged as an aid to more exact white anthropological research that would assist the settler state in its governance of Aborigines. Be this as it may, indeed precisely because of this, Tyndale's map occupies a key place in the development of maps which, in regionalising Aboriginal groups for the purposes of governance, have also informed indigenous-led projects of mapping cultures for political identity purposes. So there's a kind of interaction here. And this brings me back, the last time I'll show it, I promise, to the IATSIS map. Drawing on a long and complex history of exchanges between American and Australian anthropologists, Indigenous Australians and the Australian state, this and similar maps are now widely used in museum practices to provide a territorial visualization of Aboriginal languages and cultures. I toured, in a couple of weeks, I toured a few Australian museums and found this map just cropping up in all the ones that I went to. The ground to which these cultures are anchored, however, is a complexly constituted one. By no means purely autochthonous, it is a product of a particular anthropological way of organising varied practices into a culture, understood as a distinctively patterned way of life, rooted in a particular territory. And as such, it is inextricably connected with governing practices, including those of self-governance, located at the interfaces between white and Indigenous Australia. Maps like this are used in land claim politics and so on. Its use as an organising framework for museum exhibitions is thus not without certain contradictions and ambiguities, and it's these that I want to explore now by looking at the National Museum of Australia's 2015-16 exhibition, Encounters, revealing stories of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander objects from the British Museum. It's not that that exhibition uses particular map, but it used ones like it. This exhibition aimed to orchestrate the relations between three sets of encounters. Those between a range of collectors, on the one hand, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, and the subsequent object itineraries through which the British Museum's Aboriginal holdings were assembled over the period since the colonisation of Australia in 1788. Second, the new encounters these objects, those collections entered into on their incomplete return to the communities from which they were taken. These objects were back in Australia again, but only on loan, and travelling only so far as the National Museum of Australia rather than back into country. That's the second set of encounters. And the third set of encounters was that between the different knowledges that have informed the transit of these materials to and from Western centres of collection. These encounters are presented in the exhibition, or were presented in the exhibition, from the perspectives, sometimes different, sometimes agreeing, of the different authorities that have been brought together through the process of arranging the exhibition. Its curators, some of whom were Indigenous, some of whom were non-Indigenous, representatives of the host communities, the source communities, in quotes, and anthropological researchers. The role of the objects as material entanglements of the different knowledges at play in these encounters is foregrounded in the quote from Don Christopherson of an Indigenous Australian of the Moran people. You have to listen to both versions, the Indigenous version of our history and the non-Indigenous version of our history, because they're both telling the truth, but they're both not the same story. This immediately precedes the catalogue's presentation of the exhibition's most politically charged object, the Guigal Shield, the shield that was taken from, or that was said to be taken from, and I'll come back about why I introduced that qualification later, taken from a Guigal warrior by the name of Kuman after he had been shot and wounded by a member of the Cook expedition, the Captain James Cook expedition, to Australia in 1770, the first kind of like recorded encounter between Europeans and East Coast Australians. This was also the object that constituted the symbolic nodal point connecting the different parts of the Encounters exhibition. It was its centre. Encounters with explorers, new settlements, and pastoralists encounters between Aborigines and explorers, new settlements and pastoralists were shown in display areas on the left of a central aisle. Encounters with collectors and exhibitions, missions and colonial authorities made up the display areas on the right of that aisle. Each of the areas of the exhibition dedicated to these encounters articulated a twofold set of relations between, on the one hand, the forms of exchange or dispossession, which led to the eventual acquisition of the exhibited materials by the British Museum, and on the other hand, accounts by the various community voices that have been brought into the exhibition via the Indigenous Reference Group of the significance of re-encountering the objects in question for members of the communities of origin to which symbolically, but not actually, they were still actually the possession of the British Museum, and they still are, they're back there, the objects were momentarily returned. These communities were identified through territorial mappings of language groups drawing on the cultural area's tradition. Each of these aisles led from the central exhibition area, encounters at Botany Bay, which contained as its centre the Guigal Shield. The responses of Michael Ingray and Shane Williams, both Indigenous Australians of the Darawal people, whose country south of Sydney included Botany Bay, which was the site of Cook's first landing in 1770, indicate something of the multi-accentuality of Indigenous responses to this item. For Michael Ingray, its significance is that it gives our young people strength and identity to say that they've actually held something that was held by our mob prior to contact. For Shane Williams, the shield reverberates more to the histories of dispossession and resistance. The shield too represents all Aboriginal people, because that very place where the shield was taken from is where the rest of Australia was annexed to the British. Aboriginal dispossession started there, in that very place. What it reminds me of is Aboriginal resistance, and not just resistance back then, but resistance to the destruction of our culture right up until now. During and since encounters, the Guigal Shield has become a site of and for disputed histories in two main ways. And it will become so in a third way, which I'll come to. First, it's now the subject of a repatriation claim against the British Museum lodged on the part of Rodney Kelly, one of Cooman's descendants, Cooman being the person from whom the shield was taken, or from whom it was said it was taken. A claim which foregrounds a lament that ran throughout the exhibition, namely that the objects in encounters have only made a temporary and incomplete journey home. The second dispute is concerned whether the hole in the shield was caused by a bullet, as Cook's diary suggests, or whether, as Joseph Banks claimed, it was created by a single-pointed lance or spear. And there's more to this dispute than at first meets the eye, or rather, what now meets the eye is a hole that hovers indecipherably between two different interpretations. If it's to stand as a mark of colonial violence and dispossession, then it matters that it should be a bullet hole. Its significance changes, however, if it is a hole made by a lance or spear, albeit still in ways that resonate with current Indigenous activist concerns. I draw here on the work of art historian Ian McLean, who throws useful light on this matter in the interpretation he places on the exchange of 5 musket shots that Cook's crew fired in return for 3 spears launched by Guigal warriors when Cook landed at a small village on Botany Bay, instead of, as he was supposed to do, at a nearby beach to which, at their first encounter, the Guigal had invited Cook. He'd been invited, he didn't go to where he was invited, he went to somewhere where he wasn't invited. And this led to the exchange. As MacLean glosses it, the site to which they had been invited was intended as the site for a performance of what he calls rattling spears, a traditional performance for the negotiation of first contact with strangers, in which spears were exchanged in a symbolic contest of calculated near misses and dodges. If then the hole had been made by a spear, the shield would resonate to a ritualized performance for negotiating relations with strangers that has subsequently acquired a currency as a metaphor for Aboriginal renegotiations of the terms of engagement with the dominant culture through acts of resistance and critique. The most prominent example of that is, this would be August 2015, Adam Goodes, who in the year before I think was Australian of the Year, plays the Australian Football Code, Australian Football League, and had been subject to racial barracking on the part of many fans at various, not fans, you know, supporters of the game, at various sites where he played. And on one occasion, it got up his nose so much that what he's doing here, he's holding a spear in his hand. He went to the crowd and threw the spear. There's no spear, of course, but he was showing he was drawing upon the traditional act of resistance to show his displeasure at the racial barracking he was getting. On this occasion, a lot of controversy, as you can imagine. There will now be Nicholas Thomas, whom I've known for a long time. When he saw this lecture was being publicized with an image of the shield, wrote to me and said he and other people involved in the encounters, he and some of the curators involved, British Museum curators involved, in liaising with the National Museum of Australia to arrange the Encounters exhibition, have done research which, in a paper that they're going to shortly publish, shows that this particular shield was not linked to the encounter between Cook and the Guigal warriors in 1770. So we'll see what happens when that paper's published, but for the moment, as it isn't, my account holds true in terms of what was involved in the symbolics of this in 2015-16. The central aisle of the exhibition, running down from the central point where the Guigal shield was exhibited and the different encounters that were staged to its left and right, was devoted to a number of objects without a story, without a history, without a story. A model Torres Strait Island canoe, a shield from somewhere in South Australia. That is, these were depicted as objects which, since no specific community of origin to which they might be returned was identified, hovered in a kind of cultural no man's land. For Rodney Carter, these were objects without a story. Rodney Carter, a traditional owner from the Dja Dja Wurrung people, these were objects out of context, without a story. For an object out of context, without a connection to a creator and to those that the materials are potentially created by, a story can't be complete or appropriately communicated. So for me as a traditional owner and a Dja Dja Wurrung person, no matter the value a museum places upon our materials, it is not real. Elverina Johnson of the Yidinji people, commenting on another section of the exhibition, articulates a similar perspective, likening the British Museum's claim to ownership of the objects taken in colonial histories as, I quote, like keeping the stolen generation of objects that will finally receive their meaning when they are eventually able to make their way home. This is a recurring theme in both the exhibition and the catalogue. Without stories, without the knowledge, they're still just objects. The Encounters project is really about people. There's no other way around it. Yes, the British have got these objects and they want to show us photographs and they want to put some in the museum, but it's about people. Who were these people? Who are these people today? Well, we are these people. Without the people, they're just objects. Without the stories, without the knowledge, they're still just objects. For Tracy Woods and Nunga Elder, similarly, you've got the sticks and that, but we've got the stories. And without the stories, the sticks mean nothing. And most pithily, for Auntie Dulan Lisha Eats, a Balladong elder, culture makes real. It's the people. This is their culture. This is the real stuff. But what is the culture in question here? Nicholas Thomas' characterization of the critical work that Indigenous intellectuals perform on and with collections of Indigenous cultural materials in museums as what he calls a kind of reverse fieldwork offers a helpful perspective from which to approach this question. Thomas invokes this concept in connection with the British Museum's Melanesian Art Project as one which called into question the contention that there might be some intrinsic connection between source communities and items of customary material heritage which can alone recover the true meaning of the latter. A significant aspect of the discourse of encounters, by contrast, is one in which items, in being returned to such communities, are presented as being returned to themselves, to their truth. But this conception does not, of course, come from nowhere. It has a distinctive anthropological history and provenance. One of the key signatures of Francis Boas's conception of fieldwork was that the true meaning of objects could only be appreciated by placing them in the context of their interpretation and use by the members of the cultures to which they belong. What does this mean? He asked of the design of a cooking ladle of the Thompson Indians. According to the Indians, he answered, this means that the salmon is being boiled. This is some smaller fish being boiled. This is the spring, blah, blah, blah. Of course, we get no idea of such a notion simply by the red decoration of the object, unless the Indian would tell us what it really means. For Boas and his successors, cultures were conceived territorially as cultural areas defined not in essentialist terms, as intrinsic and permanent connections between a people, their economic and social practices, their language, religion, and myths and their material culture, but as territorially marked temporary fusions of these, effected by a creative synthesis of peoples, objects, and languages in movement from diverse sources. It was this conception of territorially defined cultures, rebutting earlier conceptions of Aborigines as nomadic, and thus without fixed attachment to place, that first became influential in Australia via Norman Tyndale's map. The processes through which this and subsequent maps gave cartographic form to the concept of culture areas became effective operators in the relations between anthropologists, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, state agencies, and non-Indigenous Australians in ways that were complex and protracted. And if we're to understand these processes and their consequences correctly, it's necessary to appreciate that the conception of cultures as the differentiated properties of territorialized Indigenous peoples has involved the production of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures where there were none before. To avoid misunderstanding, and it's really important, let me stress that distinctive rituals, customs, artistic and religious practices, of course, existed and were recognized as such by the Indigenous people concerned, and by some of Australia's early fieldwork and anthropologists. But they were not interpreted as parts of specific and clearly differentiated cultures whose elements derived their significance from their relations to one another within territorially marked ways of life. Nor did the vocabulary of culture play a significant role in how Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders interpreted the relations between material objects and their economic and religious practices. Rather, the vocabulary of culture was seen as exclusively a property of the colonizing power. For William Cooper was the secretary of the Australian Aborigines League that initiated organized national protest in the 1930s. This is the first time of nationally organized Indigenous protest. For him, the League's essential task was, and I quote, to help the natives into full British culture, a process he likened to that which Roman imperialism had played in lifting the British to culture and civilization. But the task was to lift the natives into full British culture and thus enfold them within a universal history of progress in which, and I quote again, every native would be headed for the culture of the white man. The conception of area-specific cultures, then, is properly understood not as referring to pre-contact realities, but as referencing relatively recent artifacts which shape through the complex and constantly changing relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians also shapes those relations in comprising a new interface between them. The culture that is evoked in these regards is, in Michel Foucault's terms, a new transactional reality, through which the relations between Australia's Indigenous and non-Indigenous populations have come to be increasingly, albeit not exclusively, enacted. It's put something in place that wasn't there before. The role that museums might play in this regard was signalled by Ronald and Catherine Berndt, two prominent post-war anthropologists, in envisaging how the culture concept, which they explicitly were drawing from American anthropology, might be put to use in Australian museum practice. They thus critiqued the evolutionary arrangement of Aboriginal materials that still prevailed in Australian museums until well into the 1960s, in terms that echoed Boas's famous criticisms of typological displays. As Berndt put it, without its meaning, an object, however beautiful, is dead, absolutely and irrevocably dead, allocated to some museum which concerns itself largely with relics of the past, a past which can be recreated only from the imagination of aliens or ripped from its culture context to serve an alien purpose. Its death is just as definitely assured. In a later reflection, Berndt stresses his concern in relation to Aboriginal material culture as being, and I quote, among other things, with preserving these objects, providing a permanent home for them and ensuring, their transformation as living entities placed within their socio-cultural contexts. It is this, their recontextualization as part of a contemporary Aboriginal heritage, he continues, which in bringing new life to the objects displayed in museums provide the means for a new kind of transformation which can on the one hand be relevant to Aborigines today and on the other stimulate new directions for research. It's here then in this history that I'm just tracing from Tyndale to Berndt, the influence of American anthropology, leading to a conception of territorialized and differentiated cultures. It's here that there are the conceptual underpinnings for an exhibition like Encounters, as an instance of contemporary processes of recollecting ourselves, which operates in many registers. The result of an extended set of collaborations between museum curators, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, anthropologists, and diverse representatives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, Encounters stages the putative recollection by such communities of the materials they had exchanged or lost in earlier context histories, while also recollecting Aboriginal cultural heritage into a revised place within a changing national culture. The selves that are collected and governed are both singular and specific to particular Aboriginal communities, while also beckoning those and those of the wider Australian community into a new national self that will be recomposed through the process of its collection. June Oscar, a Bonuba woman, for example, telling the orchestrates an uncompromising indictment of the ravages of, I'll let you read that, I won't read it out. Telling the orchestrates an uncompromising indictment of the ravages of colonialism, testifying to the endurance of Aboriginal people through the killing times of the frontier wars, with an acknowledgement that the setting sail of the First Fleet in 1788 was the harbinger of her future identity when she would, and this is how she refers to herself, when she would no longer be wholly Banaba or collectively Aboriginal, but also an Australian. 3 identities in one. The exhibition does not smooth over or conjure away such conflicts and contradictions. I'll come back on that point. Nor does it shy away from the histories of dispossession and ongoing violence and discrimination that settler Australia has inflicted on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, or from the differences of perspective and interpretation within Aboriginal communities. In a pointed contribution, Barbara Poulsen, the curator of the National Museum of Australia's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander programme, probes changes in the distribution of the authority to speak on behalf of community that the consultations that were entered into in arranging the exhibition were obliged to take into account. Noting that changing social pressures had obliged a partial departure from late 20th century curatorial practices that had given precedence to the voice of community elders, she identifies some of the consequences of a shift in the baton of responsibility for these matters down the age hierarchy in complicating ideas about a singular authentic voice for communities. In Coming Home, she intimates objects can expect a more cacophonous and multi-accentual reception than the invocation of singular forms of community authority might imply. Encounters is then, in all these respects, an interesting example of the refashioning of museums as contact zones, according to which, in James Clifford's conception, museums must seek to decenter themselves, accepting that the materials they temporarily host are entangled in unfinished processes of exchange, rather than impose a singular curatorial vision of their own. As such, it bears witness to the role that the culture concept, as mediated and interpreted by different generations of post-war Australian anthropologists, has played in organising the particular texture of the contact zones produced by reforming tendencies in Australian museum practices. And in doing so, in coming together with Indigenous knowledges of country, has, in some respects, recruited Indigenous Australians as anthropologists of themselves. Yet a certain degree and kind of institutional ventriloquism is inevitably involved in an exhibition format which, in its construction of the relations between culture and community, draws on a particular set of Western discourses to authorize the truth of those who speak on behalf of the communities that confer on the returned objects their lost truths. For at the end of the day, it's the museum that assembles and configures the relations between the materials it brings together. The objects from the British Museum, past and present Aboriginal works of art, descriptions of and quotes from collectors and from members of source communities, and within and among these assigns to the testimony of community representatives who are reached and authenticated through very specific and selective routes the particular truths that they enunciate. I can best unpick some of the issues involved here by considering the different ways in which the exhibition addressed its visitors. Visitors were addressed as members of particular communities if, as Indigenous Australians, they were connected to the source communities identified in its exhibition. But they were also addressed as Indigenous Australians. Visitors were addressed as individualised citizens in the case of non-Indigenous visitors, who were also addressed as Australians, with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders being called into all three positions simultaneously: members of particular source communities, Indigenous Australians, an identity going across all of those source communities, and Australians. And we can see how these are differentiated from one another while also being gathered into a beckoning unity in the testimony of June Oscar. Oops. No, that's it. I shouldn't have come to that earlier. I should have come to it now, which I have. It is the first of these conceptions of the museum's public, the conception of source communities, that interests me here. Its significance, like that of Boas's culture concept on which it draws, while also subjecting it to a distinctively contemporary community discourse inflection, is that of having replaced the earlier transactional realities through which Indigenous populations have been made knowable and governable in particular ways. The Mohawk scholar Audra Simpson draws attention to the role that pre-Boasian American anthropology played in substituting the ordering systems of clan and kinship for the conception of Native Americans as subjects of sovereign political orders in order to make them knowable and governable in ways consistent with the biopolitical imperatives of a settler state. In the kind of museum enterprise that Encounters exemplifies, it's the culture-community couplet that serves as the interface through which selected Indigenous Australians are recruited to take part in a process of recollecting themselves in ways that will contribute both to their self-governance and to the process of recollecting and reconfiguring a national we. But this, of course, is not without its problems, some of which have been foregrounded in Indigenous responses to Encounters. At the conference that was arranged to open the exhibition, a number of Indigenous artists arranged an impromptu panel to protest the subordination of independent and critical Indigenous voices to the dominant institutional script of the exhibition. And what I mean by that is the ways in which the script of the exhibition produced the space for the voice of the communities. Not that I think, I'll come back on that point too. In doing so, they elaborated on some of the questions opened up in the adjacent but separate exhibition called Unsettled: Stories Within that accompanied Encounters. These were both in the National Museum of Australia. Encounters, you went into the left, Unsettled to the right, separate doors, cheek by jowl, but nonetheless separate. This featured the work of 5 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander artists who had visited the British Museum to engage creatively with the processes and relations through which some of the objects exhibited in Encounters had originally been collected, curated, and exhibited. In standing off somewhat from the Encounters exhibition, however, the artworks in question also engaged critically with museum practices more generally, and thereby unsettled some of the assumptions underlying Encounters too. The aspiration of unsettled was economically summarized by Wanye artist Judy Watson in describing her concern as being to rattle the bones of the museum. And I want to just dwell on that for a moment, because it's undoubtedly the case that the testimony of many members of the indigenous communities to which the objects from the British Museum had been temporarily returned, there's no doubt that this had significant emotional and political significance for many of them. Now, I'm not seeking to undermine the importance of that at all. And it's very clear that for Indigenous Australians, museums are significant places that have been for some time as places that testify to, that provide the resources for reconstructing damaged histories. And so it's this position of rattling the bones of the museum, acknowledging it's important, wanting to be with it and engage with it, but nonetheless rattling it. And rattling the bones of the museum echoes to rattling spears. All right, you can hear the connections. The Wiradjuri and Kamilaroi artist Jonathan Jones offered a telling example of such rattling in action in one of the works he exhibited called Mogu Galaluga, I'm not sure whether that's the correct pronunciation, or Conceal, which I am sure is the correct pronunciation. So I'll call it Conceal. This consisted of a selection from the National Museum of Australia's collection of Aboriginal objects from South Australia, which wrapped in the 1878 text of anthropologist Robert Brough Smith's book called The Aborigines of Victoria, with notes relating to the habits of the natives of other parts of Australia and Tasmania. These Aboriginal objects, then, were exhibited both on open surfaces and in traditional display cabinets. At one and the same time, therefore, they were fully open to, yet hidden from view. Their meaning occluded by the layers of anthropological interpretation in which they were wrapped. Jones' purpose, he tells us, was to highlight the inadequacies of anthropology and attempts to deconstruct the contextual framework that defines museum collections by showing how a handful of historical anthropological texts dominate how we understand and interpret museum objects, and in turn our own cultural heritage, often obscuring our ability to see our objects and claim them as our own. While this might seem to condemn only the past practices of anthropology in this regard and to validate those of Encounters, interpreting Conceal in the light of Jones's more general practices and affiliations as a contemporary urban Indigenous artist suggests a more complex and ambivalent reading. In discussing the work of Gordon Bennett and Brooke Andrew, two urban Indigenous artists who, like Jones, worked critically on the colonial archive comprised by a museum and other collections, Ian McLean, the art historian I referred to earlier, argues that they do not do so in order to, quote, construct a family, clan, or tribal genealogy that might authenticate one's fragmented identity, or to recover an authentic Indigenous voice, but to draw transcultural connections that insert Indigenous histories into the cosmopolitan discourses of modernity. Jones also occupies a key point in McLean's interpretation of the role that the rattling of spears has played in Indigenous practices of protest and resistance. This consists in his contribution to the Kolata Chuja project, an installation at the 2014 Adelaide Biennial initiated by a group of Pitjantjatjara men. This comprised a large collection of spears brought together and hung from the ceiling in a threatening density, accompanied by a soundtrack of Aboriginal chanting to the rattling of spears and a wall text connecting the exhibition back to the moment of first contact when the Guigal Shield began its journey to the British Museum and temporarily back again to Australia for Encounters. It has been in this spirit, then, that I've sought, in probing the organisation of the discursive ground that underlies Encounters and exhibitions like it, to subject the contemporary relations between museums, anthropology and Indigenous Australians to a little critical theoretical rattling. But it should be clear that in doing so, I've also sought to echo some of the ways in which in this exhibition the museum rattles itself. And I mean that as a compliment, and I think it's one of the best things that we can expect a national museum to do, to rattle itself. Thank you.